Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to do the normal format, so I'm going to leave this on mute. I'm going to leave everyone on mute. But if you do want to ask a question, then please feel free to unmute yourself. And I'm just trying to get the technology here. So we'll follow the normal structure, and I'll start off with half an hour on the Parsha, and then half an hour on Halacha. The pasuk I wanted to focus on today is a pasuk in Parshat Emor, and the pasuk tells us, "V'lo s'chalalu es shem kodshi." This is on the handouts, which were there on the email. If you haven't managed to get the handouts, don't worry too much. I'll try and make sure that it's not overly textual for those that don't have the handouts. The pasuk in Parshat Emor, chapter Chof Beis, Perek Chof Beis, pasuk Lamed Beis says, "V'lo s'chalalu es shem kodshi, v'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael ani Hashem mekadoshchem." One should not be mechalel, profane, says Hashem, my holy name, but rather v'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael. I should be sanctified amongst b'nei Yisrael. Ani Hashem mekadoshchem, I am Hashem who gives you kedusha. From which we learn both the love of creating a chil Hashem and the positive commandment of creating a kiddush Hashem. Now, linked to this pasuk is a whole array of Gemaras, in which the Gemara learns out a variety of halachas associated with kedusha. So one halacha, for example, is a Gemara in Brachos, very connected to the events going on at the moment now, in which the Gemara learns, "V'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael," announcements and proclamations of Hashem's kedusha can only take place b'toch b'nei Yisrael, when there is a group of B'nai Yisrael together, and the Gemara learns out that this refers to a minyan, and this is the idea, the source of the idea that kedusha and kaddish can only be said in a minyan. So this is one source, one idea that we learn out from the pasuk. The Gemara also learns out b'toich B'nai Yisrael that the mitzvah of kiddush Hashem is a mitzvah upon Jews, but not upon B'nai Noach, not upon non-Jews, and so on and so forth. A whole variety of halachas which the Gemara learns out from these psukim. But then the Gemara also learns out that this is a mitzvah connected with the very difficult scenarios of Kiddush Hashem, which is a case of martyrdom. And this is linked to the pasuk that we read in last week's Sedra, in which the pasuk says, "V'chai bohem," that in general mitzvahs should be done in a manner, v'chai bohem, through which we can live. From which we learn, as the Gemara teaches us, "Minayin lepikuach nefesh shadoicha Shabbos." Where do we know from that pikuach nefesh pushes aside Shabbos and all the other mitzvahs in the Torah? The source is the pasuk of v'chai bohem. However, famously, as the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us, there are three exceptions to this rule: avodah zarah, gila arayos, shvichas damim, all of which are, for various reasons, seen as superseding the general precedence given to human life. And therefore, in these cases, one has to be martyred, and the concept of martyrdom is learnt out from this pasuk of the nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael, the idea that there are occasions when we need to sacrifice even our lives laman kiddush Hashem, for the sake of kiddush Hashem, and this is in a case where someone is asked to deny their faith, to deny their belief, even at threat of life. And similarly, a time of public persecution in which even a more limited prohibition, a more limited or more minor issa is being forced upon one, but this is being done deliberately as an attempt to create a shmad, a shas, a shmad, a time of negation and destruction of our faith, then in those cases, martyrdom unusually is called upon. So these are the sources, the ideas learned out from this pasuk. This is the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, generally speaking done in a positive manner, Kedusha, Kaddish, setting a positive example through our fulfillment of mitzvahs and bringing Kedusha in that way. And on rare and very painful and tragic occasions, the mitzvah of martyrdom. as an aside, and perhaps not as a complete aside, this time of year, the Omer, is very connected with martyrdom in our history, with tragic martyrdom in our history. We're very familiar with the concept that Sfiras Omer, the mourning associated with the Omer, is connected with Avelus, which is somewhat of a paradox. When one looks in the Torah, the mitzvah of Sfiras Omer, also in this week's Sedra, is a positive mitzvah. It's a time of celebration and preparation, linking the freedom of Pesach to the giving of Torah, the Matan Torah that's coming up with Shavuos. The Ramban describes Sfiras Omer as being a Chol HaMoed of sorts. So imagine what a wonderful period of time that is. This is a 7-week Chol HaMoed between Pesach and Shavuos. And yet, tragically, we've come to associate Sfiras Omer, rather than it being with a positive experience, instead it's become a time of Avelus. Why is it a time of Avelus? So most commonly, the most common reason given is because of the mourning over the death of the Talmidim of Rabbi Kiva. And this is indeed found already in the Gaonim. However, it is a historical fact that in the Ashkenazi world, Sfiras Omer became far more strict and was taken far more seriously around the time of the Crusades and onwards. And it's no secret that if we look at the dates of the main awful and terrible events that took place in the Crusades, many of them took place around the Pesach to Shavuos period, and therefore the Omer became a time of Avedus, particularly in the Ashkenazi world. And if you trace the source of much of the strictness of the practice of the Omer, it went from being a custom at the time of the Gaonim, based upon or linked perhaps to the story of Rabbi Kiva's students, to becoming a much stricter set of halachas in the medieval era, radiating out from Ashkenaz, from North France and Germany, where the massacres of the Crusades took place. And this is found in many historic sources. I just put one of the more accessible ones here in source 2, which is the Aruch HaShulchan. And in the bold, in the second source, V'od ra'inu, he says, She'ikre Yemei HaGezerus, the main period of persecution, Bishnos Meos, in the early years of the millennia, She'ovru b'Tzarfat v'Ashkenaz, that took place in France and Germany. Hava b'Yomim was in these days, K'mavua mer Piyutim she'osu kadnu, as is apparent from the Piyutim, what we would the Piyutim shall Shabbosos Edu, on these Shabbosos shebein Pesach la'Tzeres. So in the old Minhag Ashkenaz, there is a Piyutim said every Shabbos during Sfiras Omer. This is still kept in the Yekish shuls that keep the old Minhag Ashkenaz. And if you look at the content of these Piyutim, they're very sad. They're really awful Piyutim. The closest those of us who don't say these Piyutim come to them is the Kinnos that we say on Tisha B'Av, which reference the very terrible events that took place during the Crusades, and really unprecedented at that point in time in Jewish history for 1,000 years, really since the Churban Bayis, since the destruction of the temple. There hadn't been such a terrible period of persecution. Interestingly and painfully, there was a second set of awful events that took place in the Omer, which was the massacres in the Ukraine of Khmelnytsky, the uprising against the Russian overlords, which also took place quite significantly during this time of the Omer, as pointed out by Rabbi Yaakov Emden in his Siddur. So the Omer is a time of persecution. Why do I tell you all of this? Because there is a link between this pasuk of Kiddush Hashem and the events of the Crusades, and the concept of having to sacrifice one's life on due to the demands of martyrdom imposed most prominently in Ashkenazi literature during the time of the Crusades. And here I want to share with you a thought from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, which I've printed in source 3. And the thought has a very inspiring and important message to us in terms of the positive aspect of Kiddush Hashem, and also an association, a very sad association, in terms of some of the difficult elements of Kiddush Hashem. And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky picks up on the strange phraseology of the pasuk, because normally the pasuk in mitzvahs, halachas, commandments written in the Torah, you would expect the pasuk to be phrased in the second person. Thou shalt do X and thou shalt not do Y. And indeed, the beginning of the pasuk is phrased like that. V'lo s'chalalu Hashem kodshi, you should not profane my holy name. But then it carries on in the passive sense, but I should be sanctified b'soich b'nei Yisrael, amongst the children of Israel. It doesn't say, you should sanctify me, like we would expect it to say, but instead it says, I should be sanctified in the passive. Now what's going on over here? Why should this be the case? And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky really very wonderfully in source 3 directs us to the language of the Rambam. And the Rambam, when he brings this command of Kiddush Hashem, and this is in source 4, opens up the commands. He starts the commands of Kiddush Hashem, again with unusual phraseology. And the Rambam knew a thing or two about reading texts with care, and he also knew a thing or two about writing his texts with care. And look how the Rambam writes the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. This is in source 4, found in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the foundations or principles of the Torah, right at the beginning of his great halachic work, the Mishnah Torah. The Rambam dedicates a section to philosophy and to beliefs, the foundations of the Torah, and then goes on to some of the practical implications of these beliefs. And he tells us about the concept of Kiddush Hashem, including, at its worst and most extreme, martyrdom for faith. And the Rambam in source 4, at the beginning of the 5th chapter of Kiddush Hashem, of Yesodei HaTorah, says, Kol Beis Yisrael, Mutzuvim al Kiddush Hashem. The whole of Beit Yisrael, the house of Israel, are commanded on the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. Shenema v'nikdashti b'toich b'nei Yisrael, as the pasuk says, v'nikdashti, I should be sanctified amongst the b'nei Yisrael. And so he carries on, and he says that if it's a case of being forced to do a mitzvah, an avera, deny one's faith, one would have to sacrifice one's life. Now, why does the Rambam open up this halacha by saying Kol Beit Yisrael, the whole of the house of Israel, are commanded? I mean, the Rambam is addressing himself to the readers of his Mishnah Torah, those who are interested in halachic practice, who are turning to the halachic work of the Rambam to find out what to do. And therefore, normally his target audience means everyone is commanded in this mitzvah. If the Rambam wants to distinguish, this is perhaps only a mitzvah for Kohanim or Leviim, or perhaps only a mitzvah for men, or only a mitzvah for women, then again the Rambam normally says that. What's this Kol Beis Yisrael? I believe it's a terminology not found anywhere else in the whole halachic works of the Rambam, in which he introduces a mitzvah in this form. So this is most strange. And brilliantly, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky suggests that here the Rambam means all members of the household of Israel, including children. And he references the psukim where we find Beis Yisrael used in this way. And I just put a sample here in source 5 from Hallel, a pasuk that we know. Hashem Zachani Yavarich. Yavarich is Beis Yisrael. Hashem, who has remembered us, he will bless Beis Yisrael. Who is this Beis Yisrael? It carries on. Yavarich Hashem HaKatanim im HaGadolim. The Katanim, those who are little, the small ones, children, along with adults. In which case, the Rambam here is saying that this mitzvah, uniquely amongst all mitzvahs, applies to children as it does to adults. And this, very beautifully and powerfully, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky suggests, is why the pasuk is phrased in the passive. Unlike all the 612 other mitzvahs, which are addressed to the doer, to you, to the doer, this is a mitzvah where the outcome is what we are interested in. There needs to result a Kiddush Hashem, and therefore the expectation upon us as adults is to embrace and to include our children also in this mitzvah, and therefore Kol Beis Yisrael. This is a mitzvah addressed to all the household of Israel. So says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky in his work on the Torah, in his MS Yaakov. He also points out that the Rambam in his Sefer HaMitzvahs, in the list of the 613 commandments, also brings a pasuk that seems to indicate this reading. And this is in source 6. I printed a fairly lengthy extract of how the Rambam lists the mitzvah, the 9th mitzvah in the Torah, in his list of 613 commandments, which is to sanctify Hashem's name. And the source of this is v'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael. I should be sanctified, again in the passive person, as we said, rather than directed to the listener. And the Rambam tells us this is a mitzvah, a positive mitzvah, to publicize and spread true belief in the world. If you like, this is in a sense a source for the concept of kiruv, of spreading awareness of Hashem in the world. This is a positive mitzvah, which should be done through us creating a Kiddush Hashem, through being exemplars of ethical and holy and spiritual practice and lifestyle. And then, as we said, it also has, as the Rambam carries on in source 6, also has a negative connotation, which is on occasion at the top of page 2, we must rather submit to death rather than allowing someone to think that we have denied God. Now, in truth, idol worship done with a gun to our head, or denial of faith done with a gun to our head, isn't really a negation of belief. Nonetheless, this is the commandment of Kiddush Hashem, not to allow ourselves to give the impression that we have given up our faith. And the Rambam brings an example of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah as people who gave up their faith, even in times of who gave up their lives rather than give up their faith in times of persecution. And he references a pasuk in Yeshaya, and this is right at the end of source 6, in which he says, "Lo ata yovesh Yisrael v'lo panov yechavru." They will Yaakov, Israel, will not be afraid, their face will not turn white, because they will see in their midst, Ki berosa yolodov masa yodo bekiva yakdishu shemi. They will see in their midst how even their children sanctify God's name. And this the Rambam takes as a reference to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, perhaps based upon the midrashic understanding that they were below bar mitzvah, they were still children when this event took place. And the Rambam brings this pasuk seeming to indicate that even our children are commanded in this mitzvah, and he explicitly says, "V'sheyiru bahem yolodim," that the children are able to, it will demonstrate at that time their commitment to the values of Judaism, of Yiddishkeit, even at the price of Kiddush Hashem. So this idea of Rabbi Yaakov Konetsky starts off sourced in the pasuk of V'nikdashti, the passive use of the word, indicating that this isn't just a commandment directed to us as the normal adult readers of the Torah, but this is something about creating the end result, and therefore there's an expectation in terms of the result that's meant to be achieved. This includes, therefore, he suggests, even involving our children who normally aren't commanded in mitzvahs. We might think that when it comes to making a Kiddush Hashem, this is our children are exempt, they're below bar mitzvah, they're not obligated in these mitzvahs, maybe there's an obligation of chinuch, but this isn't integrally their own commandment. And V'nikdashti teaches us this isn't the case. We have a responsibility to create a Kiddush Hashem, and through so doing, involve our children with this. And then he carries on that the nuance of the language of the Rambam in 2 places indicates this is the correct reading. Kol Beis Yisrael, the mitzvah is commanded to Kol Beis Yisrael, the whole of the house of Israel. As per the language in Tanakh, Beis Yisrael is used for a term to include even children, not just adults. And the language of the Rambam himself, in which he seems to read the story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah as involving children, as per the psukim. So far, so good. This is a mitzvah that even includes our children, and we understand that. However, the implication of this idea led to a very painful halachic debate in the Middle Ages, in the medieval era, at the time of the Crusades that we already referenced. And this question was, what is the obligation of children in martyrdom? Meaning to say, we would think that there's an obligation to avoid Avodah Zarah and the other 3 cardinal sins, the other 2 cardinal sins, murder and immorality, on an adult who are commanded in these mitzvahs. But does this obligation apply to children? After all, why should the child be martyred? The child, in truth, will not be transgressing any prohibition. And the worst prohibition, the parents could be argued to be transgressing, is that of chinuch. But one doesn't need to give up one's life for education. And there was a tremendous and very, very painful debate around this point in the era of the Crusades. And here I'll just put one reference involved in this. And this is a comment, a very painful comment, of the Bali Tosfos, the Tosfos commentary on the Torah, written on Parshat Noach. Now, the reason he's writing this on Parshat Noach is going on chapter 9, Pasuk 5 in Noach, which talks about the responsibility we have, the Noachide responsibility, the responsibility B'nai Noach have to preserve life, which includes preserving one's own life. and the prohibition against damaging oneself, committing suicide, as expressed in this pasuk in Bereshis. Now, most of the time we are aware that someone who's in a situation of harming themselves and self-harm and so on, this is obviously a condition that needs empathy and appropriate professional support. However, the halacha, the core halacha, is that in a situation of voluntarily choosing to put oneself into a needless position of danger, or endanger oneself to risk one's life, and certainly, God forbid, to end one's own life, this is the prohibition as expressed in this pasuk. And Tosfos is discussing the parameters of this prohibition, and he brings a terrible and painful dilemma that people faced in the Crusades. This was a dilemma faced close to home in the Clifford Tower incident in York, and we have references to it from the writings of many other survivors of the Crusades in Europe in the medieval era, in which people were holding at bay the mob who were out to break through, whether it was Clifford's Tower, in which they were sheltering in a castle, or whether it was a fortified shul or the like. And they knew that they only had a short amount of time left to live. And these people were desperate to avoid the painful situation of their children being forcibly converted and raised as Christians. And in some cases, they took the decision that it was better to martyr their own children rather than allow this to occur. And this is our very discussion over here about the reading in this pasuk. How far should this pasuk be taken? Now, it's not obvious that just because the positive of the pasuk, the idea that we need to include our children in the midst of Kiddush Hashem, means that it should be taken so far to even include martyrdom. However, certainly, if the mitzvah is even one that is inclusive of children, there is a conversation to be had about this. And Tosfos, the author of our text of Tosfos as we have in front of us, brings a story in which a certain rabbi paskened, he doesn't tell us who it was, that children indeed should be martyred in such a situation, rather than allowing them to be captured, taken out of control of their parents, who would certainly be martyred, and forcibly brought into the Christian faith. Tosfos there in the source decries this decision absolutely, and he says the idea of us taking into our own hands and actively killing children to avoid their capture, this is certainly wrong. However, the idea that a child might also be held responsible, or parents might be responsible, even to the extent of martyrdom of children, is something, as I said, discussed in this Tosfos. And the basis of this topic is this pasuk in Al Sedra, V'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael, in which you see that the phrase isn't put in the positive, in the direct second person as a commandment, but rather is about the result. So this is an unusual and, please God, rare, extreme version of the shiur in some of the painful scenarios of our history. However, the more common version of this scenario, the idea that we need to be responsible for the kedusha of our children, and that they are also included unusually in the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, is certainly an idea that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky expresses in this pasuk, and one which I think is a powerful insight into reading this source. So in terms of the thoughts on the Sedra, I'll stop there, unless there are any questions, in which case please temporarily unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll go on to the second half of the shiur, which is about the halachas of kashrus.
Rabbi Zobin, it's Polly here.
Hi, yes.
Hi. How would the Rabbonim today, Poskin, if God forbid we were ever in a situation like that with our children? How would we manage that? What would the Rabbonim's responses be today in the year 2020?
So it's very interesting. We had in our shul in Yisrael about 4 years ago a learning day in which we were graced with the presence of the very wonderfully named Chaim Soloveitchik. He is a great-grandson of his more famous ancestor. He's a son of Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, the Rosh Hashiva of the very great Rosh Hashiva of YU, and he is a historian, and he is a specialist in the medieval era. And when he came to visit, he spoke about his subject of interest, which was the Crusades and, in general, medieval Jewish history. The Crusades is a very sad element of medieval history, but there's many other aspects of the history. He's a fascinating man, incredible Talmud Chacham, even though his career he's chosen to make in history rather than in Torah. And his knowledge of learning has given him a big advantage over regular historians. Because when you're trying to learn history, most of the record books are about the actions of kings and powerful people and the rich. And it's very hard to get detail about day-to-day life. However, halachic work is an absolute mine of information about day-to-day life. Because if you can see what halachists are dealing with, she'elot teshuvot that are asked, the questions asked of Rabbonim, those are to do with day-to-day regular life, how the simple folk live, how regular people live, who are dealing with common business questions and farming and cooking and running their homes. And he has mined and really made a career of using his knowledge of Torah also to understand better circumstances of life in the medieval era. And he speaks about a lot of that, and he also speaks about the most terrible shiurs that come up, which is that of martyrdom in the Crusades. And I had the great privilege after this session to spend some time with him, several hours with him, and maybe a conversation for another day. I asked him a lot of his family history and about his great father, Rav Soloveitchik from Yeshiva University, who was a very, very complicated person. But amongst other things, we did discuss this question of martyrdom. And I will tell you what he said to me, and this is the reply I will give to you. It's not a question that can be answered till one is in such a situation. And it's a question then that needs to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. The thought of sacrificing one's children doesn't bear contemplation. It's impossible to put oneself into the mindset of people who are undergoing these experiences and therefore offer reasoned halachic advice. The Tosfos that we have is of the view that is definitely not something that should be done, and I suspect that would be the normative halachic approach. I want to stress again, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky's very profound and beautiful idea does not have to translate into the idea that God forbid that this should lead to martyrdom of children. He's talking about the positive of the commandment, but it does open up questions of martyrdom and sacrifice also, which is the most extreme expression of Kiddush Hashem. Please God, none of us will ever face the most extreme expression, but the moderate expression is important for us to know. The mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying our children, being role models of what it means to sanctify God, is a mitzvah on them, even or a mitzvah on us, even under bar mitzvah. This isn't mere chinuch. This is us bringing sanctity into the world and Kiddush Hashem to how we raise our families also, and that's the idea that he expresses.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll move over to the halachic section. Okay, so let's talk now about the mitzvah of Challa. We were looking at the kashrus last time, and we started, we're part of our series on kashrus, and we started looking at the mitzvah of hafrashas Challa. Very briefly, I pointed out this was a postuk. This is a set of psukim in the Torah, in Sefer Bamidbar, which tells us that when we come to the land of Israel, to Eretz Israel, we need to take hafrashas Challa. The mitzvah min ha-Torah, the Torah obligation only applies in the land of Israel. However, the mitzvah drabanon, the rabbinical mitzvah, applies even in Chutz La'aretz, hence the process of hafrashas Challa that we do nowadays. Now, I mentioned very briefly that the quantity of Challa that is meant to be taken, the quantity of hafrashas Challa, when does one take Challa? And the answer is only when one has enough dough upon which the obligation falls. The measure given in the Torah is given in terms of beitzah, number of eggs. We discussed last time the complexities of the calculation. I was asked to clarify my view on this, and therefore I will start with that. The measures are complicated. However, it seems to me a normative pasuk is that at 1.2 kilograms of flour, one should start taking challah. However, since it isn't certain that one is obligated to so do, one should only take with a bracha at 1.6 kilograms. And the logic behind this is as follows. Between 1.2 and 1.6, as I explained last time, how to do the calculations is a little unclear. It's not certain whether we need to take challah. Therefore, it is appropriate to do so from 1.2 kilo and up. However, when it comes to making a bracha would involve, if the mitzvah is not done, the bracha would involve a bracha levatala, a misuse of Hashem's name, which according to the Rambam and many others is transgression of the law of one of the 10 Commandments, one of the Aseret HaDibros, that no sister, Shemi Lashov, don't say my name in vain. Making an unnecessary bracha is therefore a Torah prohibition, and therefore one should not make the bracha on Hafrashas Challa unless one is certain that one's obligated to do so, which is 1.6 kilos of dough. Now, sometimes one finds oneself in a situation where the quantity is a little less easy to measure, and it's unclear whether the quantity exists. And this can take one of two forms. Scenario number one is, when I create several batches of dough, do I count this as one baking incident, in which case there's enough dough for challah to be taken, or is there lots of separate batches of dough, in which case I do not need to take challah? And the basic answer is that if I have two small sets of dough, neither of which has the measure of challah, they can be amalgamated into one large dough in one of two ways. Either by what's called in halacha neshika, kissing the doughs together, the doughs touching each other, or by them sitting together in one utensil, one basket, or one bowl of dough or the like, or wrapping them indeed in one cloth. Now, if they are of a form that this only works if they are of a form where they are indeed one sort of dough. In other words, you wouldn't have an issue with combining them. If, however, let's say you have a batch of challah dough and also a batch of cake dough, in that situation, they're two different qualities of dough, and merely putting them together in one utensil or touching them together wouldn't make them into one batch of dough, because these are two very different baked goods. So this is the first halacha I wanted to mention. Quantity of dough, 1.2 or 1.6 kilo of flour. They count as one batch if there are two conditions. If they are one sort of dough, more or less, in other words, they're pretty much the same type of dough, you wouldn't mind them merging into one dough. They're not two different sorts of dough, like a cake dough and a challah dough. And secondly, they've been together in some form, either touching or in one container, one utensil. That's the first halacha. There's also another halacha, which is the opposite. What happens if I have one batch of dough, but one that's going to certainly be separated and not used together? So this is discussed in the Gemara, in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and it says that in a case where one individual needs a large dough and distributes it to other people, such that each portion is less than one dough, divides it, in that case it doesn't combine into one batch of dough, and no challah would be taken. Now there's a lot of controversy amongst the poskim as to how exactly to understand this. There were poskim that said if you make a large batch of dough and you're planning to split it even for your own use into several loaves, you will not take challah. But this is certainly not the halacha, this isn't how we do things. And this would really only apply in a case where you're separating it into separate batches, such that they're not going to be baked together, they won't be baked in one oven, they're going to be completely separated and don't have a commonality at all between them. Now in practice it's very rare to have such a scenario. I'll give you a couple of cases where this halacha wouldn't apply, and then one case where this halacha would apply. So if I'm baking a large batch of dough and I'm planning to split it into several smaller loaves or rolls, challah should still be taken, because I had the some totality of dough, and I'm planning to make out of this food which will be used by me. What happens if, for example, I'm planning to distribute the loaves to lots of different people? Nonetheless, since at this moment in time it's still one batch and I still own it, it would be it would still be chayv and challah. What happens if I'm doing a kids activity? For example, I've got a party in my house and kids bake. They all bake their own little portion of dough. However, it was all made as one large portion of dough, which should have been obligated in challah. And then they're all going to be baked together. If they're going to be distributed separately to each of the kids, but at this stage it still isn't determined who's going to get what, then again they would be chayv in challah. But the one scenario in this sort of case where the law of the Talmud Yerushalmi that we said would apply is if each portion, each roll is made separately by a kid and is identifiable such that they will receive their own roll. So often a class, for example, will engage in an activity where lots of a large portion of dough is made and then it's given out to each kid, and each kid bakes this dough into their own roll, and each roll is different. They shape their roll in interesting and different styles, and each roll is baked by the kid in such a manner, and then distributed and given out to the kids as an identifiable form. So in this situation, since the rolls are separated off, in that situation challah will not be taken, because these are not one merged batch, but these are separate batches, and therefore the shiur of challah wouldn't apply, even though a portion of dough was made. So this is a one halacha to be mentioned. Moving beyond that, what else are the criteria of taking challah? So far we've said the first criteria of taking challah is quantity. It has to be a sufficient quantity of dough to be used and baked together, or used by one person, as opposed to where it's clearly determined that it's going to be separated. Condition number 2, it has to be a certain sort of dough made from the 5 types of grain that are linked to the wheat and barley family, chita and sora, so wheat and barley type grains as opposed to other grains. Situation halacha number 3 is ownership. It has to be owned by a Jew, irrespective of whether the workers are Jews or non-Jews. So a bakery owned by a Jewish owner, even though the workers in the bakery may not be Jewish or may be Jewish, the challah is the baked products rather are certainly chayiv in challah, because the ownership of the dough is Jewish ownership. Why does the bakery have to take challah, since they're planning to sell the dough and give it out to lots of people? The answer is, at this stage, it's still all owned by the bakery, and he hasn't determined there is no particular dough dedicated to a specific person. It's all just part of a batch, and any random roll will then be sold by him or even kept for himself as they choose. And therefore the dough has the shiur, the obligation of hafrashas challah, even though it's going to be sold. So we've spoken about the type of grain used, we've spoken about the quantity, and we've spoken about ownership. Now we have a question, are there any other halachas in terms of the quality of the dough? What about the liquid that's mixed in to the dough? And here there's an important halacha to mention. It isn't just what we would call bread that is chayiv in challah, but anything which the Torah refers to as lechem, which even includes mazonos, even includes cake. In halachic terminology, there's 2 sorts of bread. There's regular lechem, regular bread, regular pat, which is eaten as a non-sweet, as a savory main part of a meal, and that's hamotzi and birchas hamazon. And then there's a different sort of bread which is eaten as a snack, as a biscuit, as a cake, and that would be mazonos, but it's also bread. And therefore dough made with fruit juice is also obligated in challah. However, for technical reasons that I'm not going to go into now, if it doesn't contain any water, or any oil, olive oil, or any honey, or any wine, in other words, if it doesn't have certain specified liquids in it, then you wouldn't make, then you would not take challah with a bracha. However, normal cake dough includes water in it. It just has the addition of a significant quantity of fruit juice, and in such a case, therefore, it would need challah to be taken with a regular bracha. If you ever make a batch of dough with no water in it whatsoever, then ask a shiur in that particular case. However, in general, if it has some water in it, or some olive oil, or some milk, or some wine, then that would be enough for, it would be obligated in challah. Challah would have to be taken. So this is in terms of the ingredients of the challah. What about in terms of the texture of the dough? Would this only include a proper dough, or would this even include a batter or the like? So the basic answer to the question is, as long as either it was a dough, or it is baked such that it ends up as a bread or loaf or cake-like material, then it would be chayiv in challah. It would have to have challah taken from it. So if I make a dough, then certainly challah has to be taken from it. If I have a batter, which I then pour into a cake tin, such that it ends up as a loaf or a cake, and then it's baked in the oven or in a baked on a sort of a, they call them wonder pots, I think, pots that are used to bake baked goods, and it comes out as a cake or loaf-like outcome, then it is obligated in hafrashas challah, in the mitzvah of taking challah. However, if it's a batter that is poured over a flat tray, so that you end up with a sort of pancake type outcome. So it's just poured onto a liquid which you pour, you spill out, and then it spreads out and ends up making a flat pancake. In that case, since it is neither a dough nor does it end up as bread, in that situation it will not be obligated in Hafrashas Chala. Now the basis of this is the pasuk that we looked at the beginning, the pasuk that we referenced from Sefer Bamidbar, in which the pasuk says, the ba'ochelchom melechem ha'oretz, when you eat from the bread of the ground, you have to take, of the land of Israel, you have to take challah. And then the pasuk carries on and it says which challah should be taken. Reishis ariseseichem, the first of your kneading trough, the first dough that is created. So we see from this several things. We see that the appropriate time to take challah is when it is in dough form. But we also see there's an obligation upon bread, even if the bread wasn't in dough form. And therefore one of the two is enough to make this a bread which is obligated in the mitzvah of Parshat Chala, either if it started off life as a dough, or if it ended up as a bread, even though it started off life as a runny batter. These are important halachas to be aware of. As I said, ideally, challah should be taken in the dough stage. However, if one forgot to do so, one can take it in the loaf of bread stage also, because it ended up as a loaf of bread. And therefore, if someone forgot to take challah, then they should take it once it's baked. And I think we discussed last week what to do if one forgot to take challah and Shabbos has started, how one can deal with the situation in that scenario. So this is the sort of material that demands challah to be taken. The take-home message basically from this is, if one's baking bread and one makes enough bread, one should certainly take challah. If one's taking cake, one should also realize that the obligation of challah applies, even though it is a sweetened cake, unless it has literally no water in it, in which case the shiur should be asked. And even if it is a very runny batter, nonetheless, as long as it will, in the outcome, end up as a cake, challah should be taken. If it ends up as a pancake, that's the one scenario, because it started off life not as a dough, it was just a batter, and it finished off not as a loaf. In that situation, it wouldn't qualify for the obligation of Hafrashas Chala. I'll pause there just in case any questions, and then I'll continue. Okay, now the final issue that needs to be looked at in terms of the manufacturing process of bread is, are there any halachas in terms of how it is baked? And the answer is that there is a machlokas, a dispute about this matter. What happens if I make a dough and in the end it isn't baked into, isn't baked at all? So how would dough not be baked? Well, it may be that it is deep fried, in which case it's immersed in liquid. And from a halachic point of view, this is the same as boiling, because it's immersed in liquid. Or there may be other scenarios in which it's boiled. So this would apply to pasta. If one makes one's own homemade pasta, one makes a dough, as far as I understand, and then it's boiled in water. It's never baked. Also, if one makes dumplings, I think, dumplings like kreplach and things like that, these are also boiled. They're made in a dough and then they're boiled, and then again, they're not baked. And similarly, deep-fried foods like homemade donuts or manufactured donuts, which are deep-fried, again, it's not clear if they are chayav in baking. Now, just to chayav in Hafrashas Chala. Just to define baking from a halachic point of view, if something is baked in a oven, or if something is fried, dry fried, meaning it's just baked on a pan with just a minimal amount of oil to avoid non-sticking, that is baking. It's a dry baking. Whether it's in an oven or it's on top of the flame, but dry baked in a pan. However, if something is immersed, whether it's immersed in water, which we would call in English boiling, or whether it's immersed in oil, which in English we would call deep frying, from a halachic point of view, since it's immersed in liquid, this is boiling, not baking. And is this obligated, is this chayiv in challah or not? So Rabbeinu Tam, one of the early Balei Tosfos, was of the opinion that this is not obligated, is not chayiv in challah, even though it was a dough, and we saw the pasuk mentions dough. Nonetheless, the pasuk says this is something that has to be taken from lechem. And since this never became lechem, it never became bread or cake, and was merely a boiled dumpling or donut or krepelach or something of this pasta or something of the sort, therefore it would not be chayav in challah. In practical halachic terms, Rabbeinu Tam is not clearly the halacha. The Shulchan Aruch does seem to paskin like Rabbeinu Tam that it is exempt from challah. However, the Shach, who lived, actually, we mentioned before, the times of the Chmielnicki massacres, he lived during that era in East Europe, and from in the Minhag of Ashkenaz is a very prominent and important posek, disagrees and believes that even fried baked products, even fried dough products do need hafashas challah, and therefore we should take hafashas challah, we take challah, but without a bracha in this situation. So we've spoken about quantity, we've spoken about the material used, 5 grains, we've spoken about fruit juices, we've spoken about the dough, whether it's a dough or a batter, and now speaking about baking, if it's baked in a classic manner, then challah is taken with a bracha. If it's baked in a non-classic manner, i.e. boiling or deep frying, it remains unresolved, and therefore we take challah but without a bracha, as per the view of the Shach. Now, I'm being asked here about, someone asked me privately in the chat about bagels, and he says bagels are boiled, then baked. What's the situation with that? So I'm not going to say who it is who asked the question, but he's someone who knows a thing or two about food and food preparation. And this is indeed, as he said, this is correct. Bagels are boiled and then baked, though I'm told that nowadays commercial bagels are steamed rather than boiled and then baked, and that produces the same outcome of the sort of the texture and taste that one's looking for in bagels, but it's more uniform and easier to do, and therefore they're generally steamed and then baked. The halacha with these is that they are chayiv in challah, since the eventual product is baked, and therefore they are obligated in hafashas challah, even though they are initially boiled, but then they are baked, and therefore this ends up as a baked product. Now, I'll just mention over here a related set of halachas, which are somewhat analogous to this discussion, but not identical, which is the question of bracha that you make on such products. So if you have a dough which is baked, is boiled, not baked, what bracha do you make on it? So one may be tempted to think that this is identical to the discussion around challah, and those who would say that challah has to be taken would say that you say hamotzi, and those that would say that challah is not taken would say that you say mazonos, because this isn't true bread. However, the consensus of poskim is that this is not the case, and the reason is as follows. What determines the chiyuv of challah, the obligation of challah, isn't just the final outcome, whether it's bread or not, but as we said, whether it starts off as dough. After all, this is the language of the pasuk. Reishis harisesechem, you should take the challah when it's in dough form. And the dough, which eventually will be boiled or fried into pasta or donuts or the like, is still good dough and therefore obligated in challah. Bracha, on the other hand, is made on the food product as I currently have it in front of me. And the food product that I currently have in front of me was not baked, but was only boiled. And therefore the food product is not genuine bread. It's a flour-based dish, cooked dish, but it isn't bread. And therefore this flour-based, dough-based cooked dish would only be mazonos. And therefore in terms of practical halacha, this is certainly how we rule, that boiled products, such as deep-fried donuts or pasta or dumplings and so on, would be mazonos rather than hamotzi, since they are deep-fried or boiled, even though we do take challah from them and don't view them as merely boiled products. That's because they started off life in dough form and therefore would be exempt from, therefore would be obligated in challah, but since they didn't end up as a bread, they are only mazonos at the end. So this is the relationship between the bracha of mazonos and challah. Bagels, on the other hand, as per the question that was asked before, are hamotzi. They are both obligated in challah and hamotzi. And the reason for this is because they are baked at the end of the process, and therefore they end up as a bread rather than as a boiled product, and therefore they're definitely chayev in hamotzi. I'll just pause there if there are any questions.
Write it anonymous.
Thank you very much.
Wait a minute, let me know.
Make sure you're writing to Rabbi Zobin.
Don't
not
worry,
to,
I'll
you're writing to Howard and Deborah at the moment.
no, how do I unmute myself? Rabbi?
Yes, sorry.
What about crumpets? Because I presume they're motzi because they are dry baked. They're usually cooked on a skillet or a griddle or something.
Yes, so this is a this is a good question. As far as I know, crumpets start off life as a dough, and they are baked over a dry flame, and therefore, from a halachic point of view, this would count as baking, and they would be obligated in hafashas challah. We, in modern parlance, we call baking something done in the oven, as far as I know. However, in halachic terms, any form of dry baking is enough. So done in the oven or done on a pan on top of the flame, as long as it's only as long as it's not in oil. There's just a touch of oil to make sure it doesn't stick, or baked on a griddle or a stick. All of those would be enough to count as baking, and therefore they would be obligated in challah. I don't know if anyone's ever done this, but you can go to in parts of the Middle East, you can get a dough which is sun-baked. Sun-baking in halacha does not count as baking, so I've never been asked this, Shiloh, actually. Do you have to take challah or a bracha do you make on a sun-baked a pita or the like? But maybe one day I will. And sun-baked products do not count as baking in halacha, and therefore, a potter, they're exempt from, they're only mazonos and possibly exempt from challah also. So that's, I hope, some clarity in terms of the need to take challah. In terms of ownership, Jewish owned as opposed to non-Jewish owned, or or even Jewish worked if it's not Jewish owned. But if it is Jewish owned, then obligated in challah even if it's non-Jewish workers. Any of the 5 grains, even mazonos, even with fruit juice, as long as there's some water in. Batter, not unless it's then baked into a bread. And as far as a dough which isn't baked but is boiled, it's obligated in challah because it was a dough. But if it was never a dough and it wasn't cooked, then it wasn't baked, then it would not need challah to be taken from it. I'm going to stop there for tonight. Next week, I'd like to just maybe finish off challah and look at, I'll use the few minutes available just to say one more halacha, because I don't want to start the next topic, which is a little bit more full. But I will try next week and speak about some of the methods that are used in commercial bakeries for how to take challah. I'll mention one scenario, which is is referred to in the Torah as truma. A challah cannot be eaten by a non-Kohen. Generally nowadays, the challah becomes tomei and therefore can't even be eaten by a Kohen. And if it's mixed back into the dough, it effectively makes the dough treif. We're dealing here with the laws of kashrus. This isn't just a mitzvah to take challah, but challah dough which is untithed is not kosher, and dough which is tithed, but the amount of dough that's taken from it is then mixed back in, is also now contains within it a non-kosher food product mixed in. So what can one do in this situation? And there's a very fascinating answer to this question, which is the process that creates the challah is my decision and my declaration to make it into challah. I declared this piece of dough. I took a small piece of dough off the main challah, off the main loaf that I had, the main bulk of dough that I had, and I declared that this was challah. I gave it through my decision the status of being challah. If I merely just broke off a piece of dough from another piece of dough, it has no halachic significance. Now we find in the laws of Nedorim that someone can unravel a declaration mistakenly made. If someone makes a neder, a commitment, and regrets it because the circumstances have changed, and an unforeseen event occurred, which had they known it would happen, they would never have made that declaration, they can annul the declaration. This is hatoras Nedorim. They can say, had we known that this would be the factor, we would never have done it. And by extension, therefore, a hatorah, an annulling of the hafroshas challah can also be made. such that one undoes the separation of the challah. Therefore, there is no longer a forbidden mixture mixed into the dough that one has, but one simply has untithed dough, and therefore one can re-tithe the mixture. And this is a halachic solution to this problem. Again, if this occurs to you, ask a shiur so that details can be spoken through, but this is an important point. Just looking at my notes, I remember there was one other thing that was asked last week, which I forgot to address, which is how much challah does one have to take? How much is this piece of challah that one has to extract? And the answer is, in Eretz Yisrael, when it is min haTorah, originally the shiur was 1 out of 24. In Chutz La'aretz, where it was only ever Drabanon, the shiur, the quantity that needed to be taken, is a mashahu, any amount. Nowadays, even in Israel, one can take any amount, and the reason is because the challah is always tomei, and therefore in practice can't be given to a kohen, and therefore it's a pity to waste it and take a larger amount when it anyway can't be used for the real purpose of the mitzvah, and therefore any quantity can be used. However, for reasons that are not entirely clear, probably as a way of honoring the mitzvah, the minhag, a very old minhag, dates back many centuries, is to take a kazayas, an olive-sized piece of dough, for one's hafashas challah, and I believe this is common practice that one takes an olive-sized piece of dough. Now, since this is only a minhag, one doesn't have to get caught up in the complexities of exactly how we measure an olive and what the shiur of a kazayas is, and we can therefore take something that looks akin to the size of what you think of as a modern-day olive, and that would be sufficient for hafashas challah, though in truth one could even take less.